so much for having me. Let's get started here. It's just an absolute delight to be here in this room. I've kind of been aware of this event for a long time and always watched really jealously from kind of over the sea in the UK. It's really bizarre talking into a room where you've got this aquarium here. And I love the fact that on the other side, people are walking kind of out of the aquarium and kind of squinting through and trying to figure out what we're up to, which is why I can't help but just kind of put this kind of thing up and just kind of, I think, if together we look stern, there's kind of, I can't, maybe we should up the ante a little bit. Any kind of panic out there? Oh. Yeah. Look, I've got some interesting eye contact. Okay, all right, we should we should move on because time is getting on, and I was talking to Tatiana last night, and she was kind of letting me know that occasionally people run into her talk, and I don't want to do that. I want to make sure there's plenty of time for her. So I've set myself a timer here. I've got a fancy new Apple Watch that has a timer on it, and I made sure that it was fully charged. It's got this beautiful kind of wireless kind of magnetic charger. So overnight I had it plugged into this thing, or kind of, you know, magnetically docked to this thing. I'm all in on wireless charging at the moment. My phone now, I went out and bought one of these things, like a wireless charging dock. I actually went for this one. So it kind of sits there on the cradle, very fancy. Of course, this wireless charger does have this thing, this wire on it. And these, don't be fooled by the aggressive crop from Amazon. There's stuff going on off the side. I'm not being very subtle with my message here, I don't think, but you know, I started looking for pictures of this and I couldn't stop. This wireless charger baffles me. What the chuff is going on here? I love a wireless charger that has a plug that you can plug your wires into for, I don't know. I suspect you kind of get the point. You know, we often talk about wireless, and we're quite happy with that. But of course, wireless things have wires in them, but we seem okay with that. Serverless, say that, and people are always going to scowl at me and say, I think you'll find there's a server somewhere. Yeah, there is. They're not magic. They're servers behind the scenes, but they do feel a little bit like magic in a way. I love them because they let us kind of focus on the things we care about. You know, we're not always necessarily keen on managing servers. We've got kind of bigger fish to fry. We're able to kind of focus on the things that we have to care about when we're talking about building the most incredible user experience and creating things that are functional. This is better reworded as like liberating us to focus on what matters, and that's what I think of serverless. I used to work at a big kind of agency, and so I worked on a bunch of big projects with big clients, and it was always a little bit tricky. And the problem with big projects is that, you know, there's constraints and there's complexity and there's infrastructure. They're complicated. They're often very difficult. I love the fact that Jeremy, in his excellent talk earlier on, talked about constraints and said understanding constraints is critical to writing good software. Couldn't agree more. His talk was so full of good stuff. He also said this. He said a form should use a form tag. Very passionate about that. I can't argue with that. This talk will not purely be me just reciting the good stuff from other people. And this is deflected as a little bit, but you know, the point is that, you know, when you're building something that's big and has got lots of infrastructure for you to work with, that can divert you. And I like to think about focusing our efforts elsewhere a little bit. Chris Coyer wrote a great talk that he intended to give at a conference in London called JamstackConf. He couldn't attend because he fell off his bike, which sounds like a made-up excuse from a toddler. But he actually broke both his arms and so couldn't attend. But nonetheless, he kind of soldiered on and wrote this incredible talk. And this is like taken from that. He's talking here about, you know, where our attention is and how, you know, more and more as many front-end developers or web developers aren't necessarily kind of infrastructure people and don't always reach all the way into this kind of part of the stack, into the LAMP stack or whichever stack we're on. He's talking about how he's kind of liberated these days to work on the pieces that, you know, he's got his skills honed in. He was talking about this in this talk. Oops, I guess we're all full stack developers now. And he was kind of talking about the Jamstack, which I'll come on to in a moment or two. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm kind of conscious that yeah, okay. You know, I love thinking about technical architectures. I love kind of lines and boxes and thinking of the flow and how things are going to work and how they might come together, how I might build a thing. But I've never been like a sysops guy. I've never been someone who's going to manage lots of infrastructure or manage a server or do all of those kind of things. So I feel a little bit liberated now that we can maybe look at these things a slightly different way. And we'll get into that in a moment. So my name's Phil Hawksworth, and I work in the developer experience team at Netlify. I'm very happy to talk about all of these things afterwards and to answer questions and what have you. But if you can also grab me on Twitter and ask me questions on there. But come and chat to me. So I'm really passionate about this, about kind of serverless web, building things without servers, and this thing that we've been talking about called the Jamstack. Recently, you kind of published a book, and you can get that at find.that. Jamstack book. It's a free download. Don't say you get what you pay for. But there it is. In fact, throughout the talk, I'll try and share kind of links to things. Sometimes the links are a little bit long, so I've got this kind of URL shortener. Find.that is going to be a regular thing, and then there'll be whatever it is, including the slides, which are going to be available on find.that NEJS. And in fact, if you just go to the root of that, you can see how I built that URL shortener. But let's not get diverted. We're supposed to be talking about this. Are you being servered? I don't know if this title means anything to anyone. There's one person over there. So, really, I'm going to be honest. I'm a little surprised at that smattering of applause, but I'll take it. For those of you who don't know, Are You Being Servered is an homage to this horrific piece of comedy entertainment from the 70s in Britain called Are You Being Served? It really represents some fairly horrible misogyny, and that was very popular in the 70s, and as such it became a cult classic in America. I thought it was long gone until I searched around for it and found that you could get a DVD of this content. In fact, there was a movie of it, which is kind of staggering. The poster tells you everything you need to know, I think. So really, my first mission here today is on behalf of the people of Britain. I apologize. Of course, no apology from a Brit is really complete unless it's laced with kind of passive aggression. So I choose to apologize with the British spelling of the word apology. Yeah, spelling, hooray. Okay, I'm meandering from the point, and the point is this serverless thing, exploring a serverless web. When we talk about serverless, often what we're talking about is functions as a service, functions that you can run on infrastructure that you care nothing about. It really is just a utility that you can use. But I kind of think a little bit further beyond that and thinking about serving websites without web servers and what might that mean. We talk about that at Netlify quite a bit. And before you raise your eyebrows at me, I'll refer you back to this little slide earlier on. Yes, there are servers, but talking about things that we're not dealing with ourselves. So I mentioned kind of Jamstack earlier on, and Jamstack, for those of you who haven't come across this term, stands for JavaScript, which is the cockroach of languages, APIs and markup. And you might think, well, why on earth do we need another stack? There are stacks all over the place. We've got stacks coming out of our ears. Do we really need another one? And that's fair, but it's kind of a convenience term. Let me expand on it a tiny bit more. So Jamstack, kind of trying to define it as this. We're saying it's a modern architecture for creating fast and secure sites and dynamic apps with JavaScript, APIs, and pre-rendered markup, served without web servers. And it's kind of this pre-rendering part that I'm going to get into in a little bit. But I also want to just mention the fact that, this isn't a new phenomenon. This isn't something that's necessarily new. The wonderful Aaron Swartz kind of popularized this term, bake, don't fry, in a blog post that he wrote back, I think as far back as 2002, where he also said this. He said, I care about not having to maintain cranky AOL server, Postgres, and Oracle installs. Yeah, and he was blogging about that and the way that he was generating his site ahead of time and then serving it statically. He was doing that in 2002. So no, this isn't a new thing by any regard. But what is new is the tools and the ecosystem that's grown up around it. There's a whole suite of things that really enable this to go much further than maybe it might have done before. So, okay, what can a static site even be then? What are we talking about? Well, there's some obvious contenders for that. Sites like, React.org or Yarn or Vue.js. These are all things that are pre-rendered and served statically directly from a CDN. but you'd be forgiven for thinking that, okay, these things are static in their nature. And so, yes, they can actually be a little bit more dynamic than that. Smashing Magazine, which is a site that some of you may have encountered, is certainly more than a static site. Yes, it's a publishing platform, but it's got comments and membership areas and e-commerce and tailored content. This is a static site as well. So there are ways of making these things feel much more dynamic and kind of interactive than maybe you might have first thought. Another site, which of course we're all dying to see, is my own website, which gets literally dozens of hits in total. And it's nothing special. It's a blog site. It's pre-generated. It's served statically from a CDN. But one of the things I have on there is, automatically it's always redeployed whenever I tweet. And the way that happens is that I've got if this then that watching my Twitter stream, and if it ever sees I tweet, it will fire an HTTP post request to one of these hooks that I've set up on where it's built, which will trigger a rebuild, which will pull in the content and deploy it again. There's a few different build hooks you might see there, kind of meaningfully named. The bottom one, Alexa voice command. Yeah, Luke isn't the only person who kind of stands shouting into his living room to make things happen. Alexa deploy hawksworth.com is a wonderful moment for me. So I was kind of talking about this in the past and saying how kind of nice it is to be able to create things that feel very dynamic. And I got a bit cocky and I was shouting about it. And then some people on the internet noticed that I was getting cocky, which is alarming. And one of them was this fine fellow, Zach Leatherman, who said, okay, I think he was probably responding to me being a cocky little shit. And he said, okay, free side project idea, an HTML-only static site-generated clock that deploys a new version to Netlify every minute. Now, this is silly. So I couldn't help notice that go out. But I thought about it for a while and I thought, is this a sensible way to build a clock? And so I responded to Zach and the people who are watching, only an idiot would make what you're suggesting, and here it is. So if you're curious about what the time is now, you could go to setyourwatchby.netlify.com, or you could go to findthat.at-time, and I think you'll find it's. Oh goodness, better get on. But this is a site where it does exactly what you already kind of imagine. It's generated once a minute, and what happens is we're getting the server time and we're putting it onto a bunch of pages. Different pages, because there are different time zones with different localizations of the time. So there's a bunch of different pages. In fact, you can go to whichever kind of time zone you want. There's a bunch of them. And at the CDN level, we shape which page you go to. But it's a static site, and it just so happens that it's showing the time within the last minute. Now, I do that, again, using the same mechanism that I was using for my own site. I've got these webhooks set up that will run a build. And I use this thing, webtask.io, which incredibly allows me to run a serverless function as often as I like. I run it every minute, and I'm calling my webhook to run the build. Since I started this, it's run, 455,517 times. The infrastructure team at Netlify love me. So obviously, this is silly. Don't do this. But at the same time, the point I'm trying to prove is that a site doesn't have to be static if it's built statically. It can feel very dynamic. It can feel very current and up to the minute. And so I kind of want to expand on that a tiny bit and see how much further we might be able to take that just in the course of the next 15 minutes or so. I'm going to look at a couple of different principles. One of them we've kind of looked at briefly already, pre-rendering, and the other one is kind of serverless on demand. And they both kind of fit together really nicely when we're talking about Jamstack sites or pre-rendered, statically hosted sites. But let's talk a little bit more about pre-rendering first and think maybe about some of the motives for pre-rendering. I like to think of this. I like to think of it as doing the work now so that your servers don't have to do it later. I like kind of getting some distance between the complexity and the user. I think if there are moving parts, they're going to generate something and something might break. I'd like to do that on my terms rather than when a user comes to visit the site. And so I like that kind of model. So just to expand on that a tiny bit more, let's do a little comparison between a kind of a traditional model and then a Jamstack model. And so in a traditional model, kind of simplified, we've got a browser that's making a request. Maybe that'll be hitting a CDN, but more likely it's probably hitting some kind of load balancer, and that load balancer is going to be dished out to one of a suite of web servers that we're spreading our kind of web load across. So there's logic in there. And that web server is going to return a view, but it needs to populate that view first. So it'll go off and it'll get some data from a database server. Maybe we've got several, so it needs to figure out which one to go to. And the database server returns the data. We compile that into a view in the web server, pass it back through the load balancer. Maybe on the CDN, maybe we're picking some things up or stashing some things there, who knows, along the way, and ultimately returning things into the browser and into the eyeballs of our user. That's kind of an obviously blanket generalization, but kind of an illustration. Whereas this Jamstack approach that I'm talking about is a little different. The way that it works is that the browser will make a request for a view of a page, and that has been generated and populated directly to the CDN, and so it returns it, and we're done. Now, clearly, there are differences here in terms of complexity, in terms of what you might be able to do, but we'll dig into that in a second. The thing that I really want to just kind of talk about is the fact that where we've got all of these other lines and boxes, all of these other bits of infrastructure, when we're updating our site, when we're building it and deploying things, we need to potentially build and deploy to each bit of this infrastructure, managing versions across all of those things and keeping them all humming together. In this version, it's a little bit simpler. When we're thinking about doing a deployment is getting the content to that CDN as fast as possible. And that'll probably be the output of some kind of build where we're cranking the handle far removed from the user who's going to consume it later on. And I love this kind of separation between request time and build time. And it has a whole load of examples, and I'll just dig into a few of them very, very briefly. I'm just going to talk quickly about security, performance, and scale. So security, first of all. Well, as you might kind of imagine, we've got a greatly reduced surface area for attack. If we go back to our diagram that we're getting familiar with now, the places where cogs turn and things happen at request time, in the traditional stack, we might have logic that's executed on the load balancer, the web servers, the database servers. All of these places are places that we need to secure, and we need to make sure that nothing untoward can happen there, right the way through to the CDN, of course. So when we take these bits of infrastructure away, we've actually got far fewer moving parts to attack. And so by its very nature, we start to improve the security. When it comes to performance, well, there are lots of ways that we can focus on performance, but a traditional stack, if we're thinking about the performance of serving the assets, a traditional stack actually starts to add layers of static layers in order to improve performance. And there I'm kind of talking about caching. So back to our old friend here again. Even though we're loving the fact that it's a dynamic infrastructure so we can serve things on demand, we start to add layers of caching at the web server, even caching things like common queries to the database, caching things through the load balancer. Of course, the CDN is a big cache. In between all of these things and the dynamic parts, we need to manage the logic of how things get into the cache and how we invalidate them. And I don't know about you, but I never, ever want to have to figure out how to invalidate a cache and make sure I get that right. I won't get that right. Scale. For some reason, scale kind of gets some scorn, and we kind of think about dealing with scale too soon. But in this kind of terms, in terms of infrastructure, traditional stacks add infrastructure, more infrastructure to create some scale. So, in this scenario where we've already added our caching, we want to be serving more and more and more requests because we're getting very, very popular. We start to add more web servers, add more database servers, add more load balancing capacity. All of these things need managing. And I prefer to think of kind of decoupling and getting away from this and thinking about deploying, really becoming just getting things to the CDN as fast as possible. Now, there are, I love the groan from over there. Now, there are lots of companies that will do this kind of thing for us. Netlify is just one of them. They all kind of have some approach to doing kind of pre-rendering and getting things to a CDN and distributing them quickly. So let's move on. God, time's getting past quickly, and Tatiana's going to kill me if I run over. So serverless on demand. Well, I did mention earlier on, Jamstack having this definition of being served without web servers. So serverless functions seem like that fit in quite nicely. And sometimes it's wonderful to get a serverless function in there when you just need a bit of logic that can't live in the front end, whether it needs to be stashing something in a database or if it's doing something as simple as creating an API that is passing through some credentials that you can't have exposed in the client side. Serverless functions can kind of come to the rescue. But there's also this temptation to just recreate everything that you might have had in a server in serverless functions. And I'm kind of just trying to be the word of caution, the voice of caution a little bit there, and lean more on pre-rendering as much as possible. If we're just recreating things in serverless functions, we're free from managing that infrastructure, which is great, but we're not free from the kind of dynamic logic that we had to think about before, some of the complexity that creeps in, how we deal with caching, those kind of things. So I kind of like to think of augmentation or enhancement, because it kind of marries back to my love of progressive enhancement. But Marcus Shork, who works at Unilever in the UK, calls it this. He talks about static first as an approach. And I really like that. So I want to show a quick example. And the example is something I made for this event, just to illustrate something. It's something that we've all needed for a long time, I think. It's a site called vlolly.net where you can get a virtual lollipop. And what you can do is you can create your own kind of custom lollipop, address it to someone, write a nice message, give your name, and then you get a URL where you can send that new bit of user-generated content to whoever you like, and they get a nice, warm, glowing feeling in the pit of their stomach. And so this is an unusual example of a site that might be considered a static site because we're creating user-generated content, we're doing things on the fly. Just to list some requirements I kind of made for myself here for this example. Well, I wanted pre-generated pages with real URLs, and that's for all of the content, even for the user-generated content. I wanted the data stored in a database because I was going to be querying for that later on, but I didn't want to become a DBA or managing a database of my own. And I wanted to have instant access to the new content without waiting for the rebuild, the regeneration to happen. So what tools did I use for that? Well, going back to this page, for the pre-generated pages, I used Eleventy, which is a wonderful static site generator. Woo! A bit of love for that in this room. I used Eleventy for that. For the database, I used a service called FaunaDB, which is a database as a service, kind of a cloud database system. And for access to the new content, I used serverless functions. I used Netlify functions in this case. For each of those things, you could have used whatever you wanted. You could have used whichever static site generator you might want. I don't know why you'd choose a different one, of course. You could use whichever database service you might want, or whichever serverless function service you might want. These are just the ones that I happen to choose. And so I doodled myself a bit of an architecture, which you're going to struggle to see, but that's all right. I'll zoom in. The first piece of that is like viewing a lollipop. And of course, I wanted those to be like statically generated. So those are serving, like just requesting static files that have been built out. You go to visit those with a URL, and you get a view of that. Now, these have been built out at build time by a request to the database. This is what that code looks like. Don't worry, I don't want you to read it. I just want you to see what it looks like. You know, we're authenticating with the database. We're making a query for all of the lollies and getting their data. And this is going to be like returning a promise. And then we resolve the promise of lollies. And then maybe we catch any errors. Again, I don't want you to necessarily worry about the code. I just want to see that it's this much code. And also, I just wanted to say, resolve the promise of lollies somewhere on a slide. Tick. And so, you know, this is happening at build time. We're generating those views, and that's all well and good. But what about making these new instances, this new user-generated content? Well, this is also a static view. You saw it earlier on. It's a page with a form on it. And when you submit that form, it actually hits a serverless function, which goes off and stashes that content into a database. And then later on, we're able to revisit our view page and see the generated page that has that in it. Now, of course, once we've done this, it's going to take a little while to regenerate. Nothing's happened yet. So if we go to the URL we've been given, we're going to get a 404. But we also know from earlier on that we've got triggers and automation that can help that. And one of the things that happens is whenever a new submission goes to that serverless function, it calls this. We've seen this before. It's our old friend. It's the webhook that will trigger the build, and then we'll populate that again. So I've no idea what this slide says. The code is small. What's happening in that save function, the serverless function? Again, I'm not asking you to read this. I'm just getting you to see the amount of code that's there. Again, we're authenticating with the database. We're gathering the data and then posting it to the database. Then, once that's happened, we're firing our webhook to rebuild the site, and then we use a 301 to send the user to check the freezer for a lolly. That's all we're doing. And yes, you're kind of thinking, what does check the freezer for a lolly mean? That's not technical parlance I'm familiar with. What I'm saying there is we check the pre-generated lolly page on the URL we've been given. If we get a 200, we serve it. If we get a 400, then we choose what to do with that 400. Instead of showing an error page, we'll send the user to a dynamic view, which is a serverless function, which can return the view for them. Because no, the content doesn't exist there in the pre-generated site, but it already exists there in the database. So that means that we can call this function, our serverless function, that will return the content to the user. I'm at 26 minutes, and I'm trying to think if I can do a quick demo. I reckon I can do a quick demo. This is probably silly. What's the worst that could happen? Okay, can you see? Okay, good. Okay, so this is my site living on Netlify. Let me go to the actual site and bump this up a little bit, and I will make a new lolly for a friend. NEJS, you are all lovely. Phil, I kind of want to get the right colors for the. I'm focusing on the wrong things, I'll be honest, but this seems about right for the thing. Oh, that's already in about the right place. Okay, and then I'll freeze the lolly. Okay, so what's happened already is that it posted to the serverless function, and then it sent me to the lolly URL, which is there. Already, it recognized that it didn't render that, obviously, but it defaulted to the 404 page, which gave me the view dynamically. If I pop over here, we should see that the deploy has kicked off. Here we go. Deploy triggered by the hook. New lolly in the freezer. It's building. We could sit and watch it, but while we're waiting, let's just double check. So this URL, which is the oh dear, that's a bad thing to do. So the static URL. If I catch it in time, in fact, I wasn't fast enough to catch it. So now it's already been statically generated. So now we have a static page which will live on. She loves it. She loves the fact that there's a static page. She's amazed. So this page lives on in perpetuity, right? It's something it's always going to be generated whenever we run the build, and all future iterations will have that. It's a statically served page that we never need to do anything dynamic for. So we're kind of getting the best of both worlds. Okay, hang on, let me just unmirror. Oops, just unmirror. Okay, 2 minutes, that's fine. We can get through the rest in 2 minutes. So there's a bunch of enablers for that. So I kind of mentioned the custom 404 routing. That's a configuration which you can do on lots of web servers and lots of different services. In this instance on Netlify, this is how we do that. So for any routes that go to lolly.star, if we find an asset there, we'll serve it. But if we don't, then we're going to go to this route instead. And so that passes the ID through, and we'll go and get that from the serverless function. We set the status of a 302, which is a temporary redirect. And we say force false, which in other words means if we find something static, serve that. Don't force it to happen where we find it or not. So that's great. And we're using events and triggers and automation to make this kind of happen. Functions as a service are there, database as a service is there. These are all things that enable us to go much further with static sites than maybe we would have done before. So I love the combination of these two things used together. And I love the fact that there's kind of a shift around in the way that we think about technical architectures these days, rather than where we might have been before of seeking to optimize our site architectures by adding static layers. That's often a way we think. We think, okay, we'll build this dynamically and we'll look for opportunities for things that we could make static. I like to think of it the other way around, this term static first, where we just assume that it's going to be static by default until we find something that just simply can't. And then we can start to add things like serverless functions and what have you to start building these things out. I love the fact that we can simplify this architecture. I have to say simplifying is not dumbing down. It might feel that way sometimes, but I think that simplifying is something that it just lets us focus on what really matters, what really is important. And I love that about this kind of approach. I think moving to this kind of model makes it easier for us to reason about the different pieces of infrastructure that we have in our code. And I find that really inspiring, and it makes me want to make things. So my kind of question to you is, what should we make? My batteries are about done, so I'm going to go and plug this wireless thing in. I promised I'd share links. There are links kind of peppered through the deck here. You can get this deck right now by going to find.at/NEJS. 40 seconds over, so I apologize. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it. Thanks.